Welcome to the Well Path podcast, where we sit down with experts and entrepreneurs across fitness, nutrition, mindfulness, and spirituality, offering you an inside peek at building a business and a life that is truly aligned. I'm your host, Brooke Robbins. Let's get into it. Simon, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to have you. You have such an interesting journey for somebody in the longevity space, and I want to get into that. I'd love to kind of take it back to the beginning. You started your career in art curation. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about that, a little bit about the Moving Museum and some of the projects that you were working on when you were in that space?
So I used to work in the art world, and now I work in healthcare, which can seem odd from the outside, but it makes total sense to me. I loved, and I still love, contemporary art, and specifically contemporary artists, because to me, these are the people that are really thinking about the future. They are on the fringes of society, thinking very carefully, putting a microscope at the world and looking across all aspects of life, social life, political life, history, and they're trying to shed light on an important topic. And so it's just a process and a framework that I love. And as someone who just loves learning about life, contemporary art was an opportunity to learn about every aspect of life, because art is about everything. But what I really love doing was working with artists, and working with artists who I felt had something important to say, and helping to bring them to public attention. So my first startup, it was called the Moving Museum. We went around the world taking over huge disused spaces, and we would invite artists from all over the world to come and live and work in that space, create new work, and do a whole kind of 3-month festival where they presented the work. We turned the building into museums, but also do a lot of like public engagement where people in the city would get to learn about this art and ideas. And it was a lot about like cross-pollinating ideas from different places. So I guess I've also always been into health. I remember in like my early 20s, like friends made fun of me because I was like, I want to live forever. And they'd be like, you're crazy. But when I started becoming much more serious about healthcare, something I wanted to get into, it just so happened that the people who were studying and researching longevity and aging were, to me, the closest to the contemporary artists that I worked with before.
Really? Because
they were like, at the time when I got in, they were considered fringe. They weren't being given airspace. It was considered pseudoscience. To a certain extent, people still think it's absurd to treat aging as if it's a disease. But I was like, wow, these are, when we're talking about the health and medical space, these are the real dreamers thinking about how can we disrupt the framework. So yeah, I was instantly attracted there.
That's really interesting. And did you come across sort of like the world of longevity at Oxford or before that?
It was at Oxford. So I was in the right place at the right time. I was studying at Oxford, and funnily enough, at the time I was working on a sleep startup.
Okay.
We were creating like a no hardware diagnostic for sleep conditions. And as I was on campus, and as I was like meeting, because we were working with various people in the Oxford ecosystem to help develop this tool, I met these guys that were saying, like, literally, aging is a disease, and we're going to cure it. And this was like 5 years ago now, and I just thought it was so absurd. I was like, you're nuts. And when like you hear something that just like gets to you, and just instantly you get sucked in and you want to learn more. It had that effect on me. So I started hanging out with these guys. There was a society, the Oxford Society of Aging and Longevity, where a lot of these conversations were being had. And when I started getting into it, I went from, wow, this is a crazy idea, and wouldn't it be cool if, to, wow, there is real science here. There's a real method. There's a real framework. they're not just talking about like fanciful, wouldn't be it be cool if, but they have, a to-do list and a very credible way that I think that they can achieve this. Like these are real actionable things.
And when you say achieve this, what does it look like? Like, is it extending the lifespan by X number of years? Or what is like the craziest case scenario?
It depends who you ask. There are people that want to live forever. There are people that think that just there is no real reason that we should die. And then there are people who argue that it's more about extending the amount of healthy life that you have, so that, the last couple of decades of your life are lived in good health. So, the typical kind of example is, you live, average lifespan is about into your 80s. The onset of chronic conditions are in your 60s is when you start having them. Oftentimes people juggle multiple chronic conditions that are age-related, that are triggered by old age or exacerbated by old age. So why should we allow those 2 decades at least of life be lived in poor health? Fair. So let's keep you thinking. And then I would say there's a moderate approach. This is the idea of like health span versus lifespan. Lifespan is extending the amount of time you live. Health span is extending the amount of healthy time that while you're alive. Then there's a more moderate approach, which I think for the most part everyone agrees with, is that what we're trying to do here is we're trying to extend health span for as long as possible. And as a result and as a byproduct of that, we increase lifespan. So thinking about it more as like lifespan or an extended life being a kind of result of being healthy for longer.
Right. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And what's your definition for you?
I think the health span, lifespan one is a good one. The only argument selfishly, I would want to live forever just so that I can see what happens. I feel if you could just put me in take my brain, put it in a tube and just let me watch and see how this all plays out.
That is so interesting.
I'd be fine. Because I'm just that's where it is for me. But I think, but generally I think let's stay for healthy for as long as possible. And then, life can end.
We will get back to the nuts and bolts of the science, and I won't let this be such a tangent, but I have to ask this follow-up question on that. It's almost a spiritual question or like a philosophy of life question. But if we live forever, do you think that changes, to what extent do you think that the scarcity of life, the fact that it is finite, provides meaning? Or what do you think in terms of, okay, if we could live forever, would that change anything about human nature or not so much?
So it's a great tangent. And a lot of people want to talk about the philosophy of immortality. For me, I think the better question is, rather than because I think people say philosophically, should we allow this? The real question is, given the choice to not die, would you take it?
Right.
Because it's never
the question.
It's one thing to think about it philosophically. It's another thing to think about it in terms of if you were given the choice to survive until tomorrow, would you take it? And then tomorrow, given that same choice, would you continue taking it? And the truth is that everyone would take it. That's why people, fight cancer or they fight diseases, because they want to stay, the human will to stay alive on an individual level is so strong. So I think there's probably a lot of people sort of armchair philosophers that will sit there and think this is wrong and I cannot stand this. But it's actually, if you had the choice to live till tomorrow, you would take it and you would continue to make that choice every day it was given to you.
It's really interesting that you say that, because if you ask me, if you had the choice to live forever, would you take it? I would say no. Of
course, yeah.
But it's true that if you asked me every single day, probably I would never actually wake up and be like, no.
Yeah.
Unless I was chronically ill and so much in pain that maybe, I think it's all interrelated. So
the crazy thing is there are people that are in chronic pain and they hold on to life.
That's true.
And so this just shows that it's even still, and that's a problem because, that's the issue with healthcare. We've gotten so good at keeping people alive because we can manage diseases, we can keep you alive. And it used to be that okay, you reach 30, 40, 50, whatever, and you get an infection, you just die. Like, but you lived your whole life in good health. Now we've like sort of gotten people to stay around for so long, but the frailty is now an issue.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what longevity is correcting for.
Yeah, super interesting. Okay, we'll circle back to sort of the science behind Jung and all of these things, but just in terms of sort of painting the picture for people in your journey, one thing that I think might be interesting for some listeners is just sort of the transition from the art world into the longevity world and how kind of business school played into that. And I'd be curious to know, what was sort of your decision-making process around going to business school? I think this is like a topic that a lot of people, especially people that have kind of entrepreneurial ambition, ask themselves. And I'd love to just hear from you as to like, what was your process deciding to go in? Obviously, it seems like it ended up being pretty influential for you, but I'd love to just hear a bit about that.
Yeah, so I would say like the biggest insecurity I have is like feeling like I've never had a real job. And just because my whole life has been some kind of entrepreneurial something. And it's something every day I think about and I'm worried about. And so, for me, going to business school was like, and especially since I worked in the art world, which was like a very soupy environment. The art world has it's fascinating, and it's a tour de force of, I would say, like, how society functions. But to a certain extent, I felt like I wasn't going to be taken seriously. And I also needed to learn how the world worked. So I was like, let me go to business school. And I think two things happened. One, I learned so much. It was the best thing that I did. And this isn't like me trying to sell business school. I think it was right for me because I didn't, have, let's say, the language to speak.
Okay.
I think on the other hand, what it did was it like did the opposite thing where I was like, okay, you go to business school. Oh my God, this is so ridiculous. This is what they were talking about. So it was definitely like going to business school was great. And I would highly recommend it, especially if you feel like you have big gaps that you want to fill. And I would say like, for anyone listening who maybe like is considering business school and is on an entrepreneurial journey, I think every business school will say that, we're here for entrepreneurs and we want an entrepreneurship mindset. But I think you and I know that like being an entrepreneur is like a very specific thing.
Yeah.
And an MBA program is a very structured thing. And it is somewhat difficult to combine entrepreneurship and structure. I mean, of course, there's methodologies, there's lots of great case studies of like incubator programs and stuff like that. But yeah, I would just say, choose wisely which program you choose. Some are all of them will say we're here for entrepreneurs.
Right.
And then the truth behind the scenes is that they might not really be. I would say that I was really lucky that my program was at Oxford. And I think a lot of entrepreneurship is about thinking laterally across disciplines and, like looking at gaps and looking at opportunities. I think it's important when you go to business school is great, but business is part of the world. Business fits into the world. And I was lucky that I was in an environment where I had access to every department, was, top 5 in the world of some subject. So, go to business school, but I would say like really think about maybe what's happening on the rest of campus.
Yeah.
How can you get involved in different disciplines? My time at Oxford was spent, I would say 20% at business school, 80% in the larger university.
Really interesting. And you mentioned that when you kind of started getting involved with the Society of Aging and Longevity, there were certain like things that kind of came up that got you thinking like, wow, this is a real discipline. Can you share a little bit more about that? Like, were there specific like learnings or like aha moments that came out of that for you that got the light bulb on for what ended up becoming Jung Longevity?
For sure. I would say the first thing was the first aha moment was like making this distinction between anti-aging and longevity.
Okay.
And I would say initially my preconception of longevity or this idea of anti-aging was very much a cosmetic thing of like, how can we target wrinkles or how can we stay looking young, which is important, very important. But it was eye-opening when they started talking about like the biological aging and how what we're talking about here is maintaining biological youth. And I think I had so many associations because of the cosmetics industry and the skincare industry, which is really used and abused this term anti-aging, that I just, any mention of that, I was turned off. Like, so I think that was the first big like thing that I had to unlearn, and that the term longevity helped me understand. The next really big thing was something called the hallmarks of aging. And this is the backbone of all longevity science. This idea that aging, even though we use one term to describe aging, it's actually a collection of things that are happening in your body. But importantly, it's a collection of things that we can identify, we can measure, we could target, we could intervene, and we can reverse. So I guess what I got really excited by was this idea that, okay, aging is really complex. Well, what do you mean by like, how do you reverse aging? That made no sense to me. But once it was broken down and say, well, actually we have these hallmarks, we have these 9 or 12 things, definition has changed. We could then identify them, understand the mechanisms at play, and we know that we can intervene them. We could see it. We could see it in the lab. So it suddenly became something that you can look at under a microscope and say, that is what's happening, and that's how we can target it. And that's actually how I would say the modern longevity movement really exploded.
Yeah.
I think the reaction that I had was the reaction that the industry had, because you went from something that was really amorphous to something that was actionable. And actually, you know, what I would say is I compare the hallmarks of aging, or the invention of the hallmarks of aging, to the birth of the scientific method. So the scientific method was not an invention in itself. It was a framework that allowed a group of curious people to methodically uncover information.
Right.
And what the hallmarks did, I think, to aging is something very similar, where they didn't discover anything new that we didn't know was happening in the body. It was a way of putting it together, and it allowed an industry to say, right, these are what we're going to focus on.
That's really interesting. And did you actually end up incubating the company while you were there, or walk us through sort of starting this thing, and then we'll get into kind of what you guys do and what you offer and where you're going?
Yeah, so the plan was initially to build it and launch it in the UK and in Europe. So, you know, I spent several years after my MBA continuing to live in Oxford, building this product out. But sort of as I got closer to launch, I realized that America was the bigger market. And America was the bigger opportunity, both from a financial standpoint, but also like a customer need standpoint. In Europe and in the UK, if your health goes sideways, you have a safety net. America's capitalist system, you know, you eat what you kill, but also you reap what you sow. And looking at how the healthcare system is devastating our country here, it's putting people in debt. You know, you have a food supply that's making people sick. I just felt like, no, I think the place we really need a layer of preventative healthcare is America. I mean, of course, it's important everywhere, but I just was like, this is where we need it. Yeah,
that makes complete sense to me. And I think on kind of like the preventative side, I wonder, so from your perspective, at what point should somebody be preparing themselves or looking for this or doing some testing? Like, I'm curious to know in sort of your ideal case, right, taking the States as an example, like, when are people taking steps? Because I completely agree with you. I think, by the way, that's a global issue. Like, as you know, I live in Dubai, and I think also there isn't a lot of preventative care there either. I think that's just like a global framework and the way that we think about medicine that eventually, hopefully, and I think it will, and I think it needs to shift, because you don't treat anything. You don't even diagnose things until there are symptoms, right?
Yeah.
And I think that will change, hopefully, at some point in our lifetime. But I'm curious to just get your take on that. Like, what is the right time for somebody to be looking into this? Well,
I mean, I'd love to just, first I'll say the right time is as soon as possible. You know, the right time was yesterday.
Right.
The best time to start your preventative health or longevity routine was yesterday. The second best time is now. It's never too early to start. And I would say, Start small, start in increments. It could be really overwhelming for a lot of people, especially when you're targeting longevity. The issue with longevity is that it's as complex as biology itself. And so to target aging in its entirety, you need a portfolio approach. And what that often means is you need to do like 10 things. It's not like normal wellness or health. However, start small, pick one thing that you really want to focus on and go for it, whether that be, creating a supplement protocol, focusing on your sleep, cutting out sugars or carbs, doing intermittent fasting or calorie restriction, whatever it is, start with one of those things and start as soon as possible. Because it's easier to slow down and prevent damage than it is to reverse it. Right. There's certain things that certain types of damage we just can't reverse right now. But I love this, you're in Dubai.
Yep.
And it's so interesting, this question of prevention versus reaction and how, we live in a reactionary healthcare system and it's become so endemic to the way that we treat it. I think we need to push back on that narrative because you look at the rest of the world and Dubai has become the West, but you look at the East, you look at, and even parts of the Middle East, South Asia, East Asia, preventative health is a lifestyle. You are a proactive participant in your health every time you make a decision about the orientation of your chair in your room or the spices that you put in your food are all considered medicine. So if you look at like Eastern practices and you look at like traditional Eastern lifestyles, how they set up their entire lives were about proactive prevention. You look at the way that, Ayurvedic cuisine, or I should say how national cuisines, when you peel back the layers, were really designed as healthcare regimens, which we are now, as we dive into the science, we're suddenly realizing, if you combine your carbs with fats, there's no blood glucose.
Right.
Yeah, well, you look at like Indian food or you look at Asian food, and they always put some ghee or whatever in the rice when they cooked it. So I think the reason that this is important is because I want people not to feel that this whole idea of preventative health is going to be a big schlep and that it's something new and that we have to do this for the first time. No. This is how like most societies lived their lives. Right. And we just, in recent medicine, we sort of outsourced our health to like some doctors and some scientists and then suddenly realized, they threw capitalism in the mix and now they're just making money off our poor health. So there is like a larger story of how, humans used to live. And I think we're just rediscovering that. And I think the interesting thing is now like healthy is the new lifestyle, like the supplement that you're taking or like the diagnostics that you're doing or like a social flex in the same way that like a handbag used to be. And it seems weird, but it's also kind of cool because I think it's our way of turning health into lifestyle. Like we lost that for a minute and now it's becoming our lifestyles again. I'm
so glad that you brought this up and that makes complete sense to me. One of the biggest things that I've noticed within like our own generation that has been so exciting for me is I feel like when I was in my early 20s and kind of first starting, working or even in college, it was like there was this glorification of not getting sleep. Like there was like, who could sleep the least? And if you like pulled an all-nighter, it meant you were like a good person because you worked hard. And like there was all of this like weird mentality around sleep. And I feel like it's the complete opposite. And I think with the Aura scores, like I always joke, but like it's like a report card for adults. Like people love to brag about like their readiness score and like how much sleep they got. And it does seem kind of ridiculous sometimes, but it's also so nice. And I'm so grateful and glad that like we're kind of waking up and like we're all coming to our senses that like health is wealth and like it is truly, when you don't have it, it's the only thing that matters. Like it really is. So I've definitely noticed that as well. And I'm glad that you brought that up as I think that's a great point around sort of challenging the narrative that like globally it's always been reactionary because I think that's such a good point. And I do remember when you mentioned that when I was living in Taiwan, and I was thinking specifically about fertility. I think fertility in the West, and I would include Dubai in that, like is very reactionary. So nobody wants to talk about it until you're actively ready to have kids. And I'm just like a planner. And I'm like, I know one day I want to have kids. So I'm like, let me just do everything to make sure everything is cool. But it's very difficult to do that within the context of like a Western medical system because they're like, come to me when you're trying to conceive. But when I was in Taiwan at age 23, like I remember if I would drink cold water out of a water bottle, all of the, women would come up and be like, don't do that. You're going to destroy your reproductive system. It's not good for you. And at the time I was like, that's ridiculous, and I don't know if that specific thing has any basis, but it proves the point that people are thinking about it, all the time in their daily lives. So I love that.
I've spent a lot of time in Asia, and I love, although I wouldn't call myself an expert on Chinese medicine. I love hot pot. And one of my favorite moments was when a friend of mine, and I've been doing hot pot for years, but like I didn't realize how all of the ingredients are designed as medicines. So he was walking me through, like we were looking at the hot pot thing and it has like goji berries and all these, it has like 100 other different things. And he was walking me through and he was saying, well, this is what that's for. This is what that's for.
Gosh,
this was
that's so cool.
And it's funny because like, now it's trendy. God, Mark Hyman, food is medicine, right? And like I say it all the time and it's such a great catchphrase. But it's so funny because like you got these old white guys that are, saying food is medicine and everyone's like, wow, you're right. And it's like, no, like food has been medicine forever, like literally. So, yeah.
That is so funny. Okay, but I do want to make our way. So let's talk a little bit about Jung and sort of, I would love to talk about, the products that are available in the market right now, kind of how you formulated, what were the first, it seems like the products are kind of like going for different things, like you were saying, maybe there's different like hallmarks. And I'd love to talk about how you came up with what were going to be the first sort of products that you're offering and sort of what your plans are from there.
Yeah. So, the challenge with targeting aging is that it's a multifactorial process and it demands a multifactorial intervention. So if you want to slow down aging, you can't do one thing. This is the inherent issue. And we live in a society where everyone wants a quick fix. They want like the one pill, the one ingredient, the one intervention, the one hack. And unfortunately, that's just not how it works. So, what I was looking at when we were developing the product line was this new trend of longevity clinicians, these new preventative healthcare specialists who are filling in this missing layer in our healthcare ecosystem. Like you have a doctor to go to when you're sick. Who do you go to keep you healthy? And now, let's say the anti-aging clinic or the longevity clinician is filling that gap. Unfortunately, it's like, at least 10 grand a year, if not 100 grand or more per year. 10 grand is just to get you into the subscription membership. And then that's not just like that. That's not counting the thing. So I was looking at this and, the reason these clinics exist is because they create this portfolio of interventions around their patients. And my question was, how can we make that scalable? How can we make that accessible? And how can we make it something that can fit easily into people's lives? So you look at a lot of these clinics, and not only is it demanding from a cost perspective, but it becomes a full-time job. Like, right, you have people like Brian Johnson who show off about how their entire lives.
Right.
I think that's cute. Great for him that he's got, a few $100 million sitting in the bank. And he can, as a full-time job, dedicate to getting a perfect sleep score. I don't have that, and most people don't.
Yeah.
And I think this is this was another challenge in healthcare where, you have doctors and scientists saying, well, this is the best thing for your health, or this is what you should do. And actually, if the person isn't willing or easily able to do it, what's the point?
Right.
So like my favorite example, and what I always say is like, do we know the science behind having a six-pack of abs? Is there any question around how to get a six-pack of abs? The answer is no. We know the exact science. We know how you get a six-pack of abs. So why doesn't everyone have them? because there's a barrier, and the barrier is like you need to put in a certain type of work. So there's not, oftentimes there's this like assumption of like, oh, do you have the secrets of living longer and healthier? It's not about secrets.
Right.
It's about how can you put it into a format or make it so that people can easily do it. And that could be a cost barrier, like an information barrier.
Yeah.
But it also could be an ease barrier. So this is kind of like what I was looking at into saying, like, if we want to create a product for people to target their aging, these are the problems we need to solve for. And that's how we ended up with our product ecosystem. The idea was, how can we make a simple, seamless, self-guided program that is holistic, that can take in from the back end, take in the complexity of the aging process. On the front end, it could be super simple and easy for people to incorporate in their lives. So we sort of focused around a supplement ecosystem, because supplement protocols give you a lot for a little.
Right.
And then we focused on key lifestyle modifications that have like outsized impact on your health. So the way it works is you have a master formula. This formula is all of the these are all of the compounds that show like incredible health span and lifespan, increasing potential in model organisms and potentially in humans. We put that all in one as like a cellular aging supplement. And then we've got supplements that target complete protocols that target different lifestyle modifications. So for example, we've got a intermittent fasting supplement that helps you if you're intermittent fasting. We have a supplement that helps cut out some of the carbs from your meals. So it's called a glucose blocker. Glucose restriction is a big game changer for longevity. We have one for sleep, and then we have one for skin health. So really super easy. If someone wanted, they just pick a master protocol, they choose which booster they want, they get it delivered to their door every month. And then next year we're launching testing. Testing will allow people to measure different biomarkers that are associated with the specific tracks that they're on in our program.
Is that done through like a blood test or?
Yeah, depending on the biomarker, it could be it might be a blood test, it might be skin test. Like we have a couple of, because different tracks are associated with different biomarkers. But yeah.
Okay, that's super interesting. And with the kind of like master formula and kind of putting these together, is that something that you worked with like a science team while you were at Oxford, or? Yeah,
that was like a whole undertaking.
I can only imagine.
Oh my God. I think the interesting thing about science, there's this expectation that science is objective, or that somewhere there is objectivity. And of course there is, but no study is perfect. And there's holes in every study. And different scientists will have different opinions about, different molecules or different things. And that's just like, when you peel back the layers and get really deep in it. So we did a lot of work putting together a board of people from different disciplines. So we had this whole organizational structure where we had like a head formulator, a chief scientific advisor who was both a doctor and a scientist and an expert in translational medicine. Because you have to understand that like doctors see patients, they don't know what's going on with the science all the time. Scientists know what happens in the labs. They have no idea how things actually work in practice. The things that we can do to model organisms don't directly translate to humans. And so there's multiple different disciplines that have to go into play when you are trying to formulate something that is taking like the cutting edge and making it available now. So yeah, it was a bit of a feat, but I know we achieved it. And then so we had the chief scientific advisor who had all of these skill sets, and then we put together a team of longevity scientists, doctors, and domain experts that came from multiple frameworks, and that were all able to sort of feed in their thoughts and opinions, but it was all moderated by, there was a kind of a final stopgap to make sure that we had like a decision-making process.
Okay.
And yeah, that's how we ended up with our formulations.
And I'm curious, like through that, because you mentioned something about like glucose blockers, and can you just walk us through maybe like a couple of things that you've learned through this journey about just like longevity or kind of the science of longevity that you might not have known before that you think it would be important for our audience to like understand?
I could say some things that I think are surprising to some people. People usually like, I bet you thought this. So one of the big ones, because everyone knows that diet is important, but the question is like, what kind of diet? Good diet can mean a lot of different things. I would say from a longevity perspective, the most powerful thing that you can do is cutting out sugars and carbs.
Really?
If you look at glucose restriction diets, and you look at what happens when your body is restricted of glucose, or just on a basic level, if you have healthy glucose levels and you have a healthy insulin response, there's all of these incredible upstream effects on your body where you have these longevity pathways and longevity genes like switched on. You have all these repair mechanisms that can do their thing. When they're not healthy or when your body is dealing with lots of excess glucose all the time, the opposite is true. Okay. Those longevity mechanisms get switched off. You have all of these like downstream like terrible effects on your body. And the reason why glucose is such a big like thing that I think it's important to call out is not just because we can see that glucose restriction has all of these, and there's also lots of studies to back that has lots of anti-cancer qualities. So we can see that people who are on glucose restriction diets respond better to certain types of chemo than people who aren't. Are
we talking like ketosis or like just reducing but not completely eliminating?
Both. Okay. I mean, I would say that do what you can. I don't know that completely eliminating is the right choice, because it's also not about macros necessarily. It's about the quality of, so there's a hierarchy of like carb intakes where, let's say a candy is the worst because you get a quick glucose spike, and maybe like the carbs that are locked into a bean are okay because they're slowly absorbed into your system. So I would say you don't necessarily have to completely eliminate, but really rethink the type of glucose you're taking in, and that could be sugars or carbs. And the issue is that as we move from a hunter-gatherer society to a farming society, it became a lot easier to farm wheat and rice and things like that. And if you look at our modern day diets, it's disproportionately like carbs. You look at the food pyramid, you have carbs. It's the most important thing. This is not great for you, especially in the West, where most of the carbs that we're having aren't coming from vegetables. They're coming from pizza or pasta. I mean, pizza and pasta have zero nutritional value. And especially for people that are like vegans or vegetarians, you could go in with the best of intentions, but if you're walking around the city or, you don't have time, what you're often going to find in our food supply here in America are just carb-heavy foods.
Right.
So I think being carb and sugar conscious is probably the biggest hack, I would say. So lots of people already know about sleep.
Yeah. I think everyone's like, again, waking up to the importance of sleep.
Waking up to
pun intended. But yeah, I think it's interesting to hear you say that, because I do think it's also a relatively controversial one, especially when it comes to like the more extreme restrictive diets, such as like a keto diet, or really like putting your body through that. There's another controversial topic that you mentioned that I think would be fun to just hear some thoughts on, which is the intermittent fasting. So what's your kind of take, or what's the science that you've seen around intermittent fasting and longevity?
Yeah, so intermittent. So I would say important to make the distinction between intermittent fasting and calorie restriction. They're similar. Because you're restricting calories, but they're different in that you're restricting calories in different ways. So intermittent fasting is time-restricted feeding. So it's like sort of eat whatever you want, but only eat within a set window. Calorie restriction is cutting calories on the whole and making sure that you're sort of 80% of what you should be eating. So like semi-starvation. The data for calorie restriction is clear. It extends human lifespan. And there is no lifestyle intervention as powerful in extending human lifespan as calorie restriction.
That's assuming, though, that the baseline is like too high. Like, how do you know to what extent? Because obviously, if you don't eat enough, that's also not healthy.
So this is the issue with calorie restriction. You have to be very careful with calorie restriction. This isn't an invitation to eat tissue paper. This is being, you have to be, and this is why, with all of these things, like with recommending a low meat diet, because we see that having less meat is better for your longevity. You always have to caveat it with like, yeah, okay, but if you're going to be vegetarian, this isn't an invitation to have pasta every night either.
Yeah.
Same with calorie restriction, where you need to be a lot more intentional with your overall nutritional intake. Famously, you see someone like Brian Johnson, who, the reason he looks like a vampire and he looks so gaunt is because he follows a calorie restriction diet. It's not because he's unhealthy. Unfortunately, not unfortunately, but fortunately for him, he's got a team of doctors and chefs that kind of make sure that on the whole, every macro is accounted for and that he's getting, from the number of mushrooms to the number of things, it's all being weighed. You're likely not doing that. So calorie restriction is really great. And I would say that's like distinct from intermittent fasting. And actually, a lot of the drugs that are being developed to extend lifespan are called calorie restriction mimetics. And what we're trying to identify is what is the thing that happens during calorie restriction that extends human lifespan.
Interesting.
And there's already a couple, like some supplements are thought to be calorie restriction mimetics because we think we know what it is in calorie restriction that has the therapeutic benefits. So pterostilbene, Pterostilbine, that is or resveratrol, which works in model organisms, but not in humans. These seem to be calorie restriction mimetics. And then you see these big biotech companies trying to discover actual drugs that can do that. So that's a really big topic. Intermittent fasting, a lot more controversy. I'm a big fan of intermittent fasting. There are individual mechanisms that we know intermittent fasting triggers in the body that we know are good for you. However, lots of questions around male versus female. So women should be a lot more cautious about intermittent fasting and when they do intermittent fasting. But I think this conversation is like, it's being had and a lot of people are more aware of it. So I think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
I think the other issue with intermittent fasting, there's been a lot of a lot of terrible, lazy journalism that tries to call out how intermittent fasting is shown to be bad for you. And then when you poke through at the actual study, it's a very poorly designed study. Or, one of the big things is that you can do intermittent fasting, but then you're not controlling for what these people are actually eating.
Right.
Unfortunately, a lot of what people do when they intermittent fast is that they treat themselves or they binge eat when they open their fast. It's just human natural reaction.
Yeah.
And that is really problematic because you're subconsciously, making up for, what your body is at a loss. But that doesn't mean intermittent fasting is bad for you.
Right.
This is not different from what happens when you do normal exercise and you don't lose weight. It's very common for people to do exercise, which we know is good for you, and to not lose weight. And the reason is because the body likes homeostasis. The body craves homeostasis. And so when you exercise, subconsciously your body's like, oh my God, I'm doing all this work. I need to make up for it. You will eat more. You won't do so consciously, but we see the data. We know you're eating more to make up for this. And that's why people don't lose weight. So it's a similar phenomenon that I believe is what's happening with intermittent fasting and is another reason why if you're doing those things, you need to be a lot more intentional.
Okay, that's super interesting. And what for you, because you're so in this world right now, what's the most exciting kind of component or discussion that's happening in the longevity space? Are there any kind of new things coming up or things that are kind of putting a spotlight on that you think are really interesting as we go into sort of the future of the space?
So I would say there's two things I can call out. Number one, gene editing. Very exciting for longevity. I think if we're talking about what are the things that are going to have a dramatic impact that, we're suddenly going to see, actually I say three things. So number one is gene editing. that has the potential to add 10, 20, 30 years to our lives.
Wow.
And so, that's a very exciting area of study, but there's lots of like regulatory issues around that I think is going to cause some bottlenecks. Number 2, epigenetic reprogramming. So one of the hallmarks of aging is alterations to the epigenome. The epigenome is the layer that sits on top of the DNA that decides how the DNA expresses. So your DNA doesn't change, but your epigenome can change how your DNA is used. And there's a lot of theories that aging is actually caused by disruptions in this factor. So there's, even in the last year or two, lots of interesting examples of how we've been able to, it's called reprogram the epigenome and sort of restart it. Like we can already reset the epigenome to 0, but we don't want that because we don't want to be 0 years old. But we can do that in the lab with individual cells. Now the really exciting moment is reprogramming the epigenome or the epigenome age to, let's say, like 60%. And that allows us to reverse age without completely going back to 0. So that's a really...
Wait, but what would that mean? Can you walk me through that? So if you reverse the age to quote 0, like what would that actually mean?
I don't know what that would look like on a human level because we haven't tried that on like a whole organism. But every cell starts out as a stem cell, and then it becomes differentiated. And so if you are resetting resetting a cell to 0, I mean, essentially you're sending it to like the actual very beginning. And we don't want to be all stem cells, right? We want to be nerve cells, bone cells. We need a collection, but we just want to be like a younger version of all of those things.
Yeah.
So that's really exciting.
Wow.
And like we can see amazing stuff in the labs. And I would say the third really most exciting thing, which I'm less bullish on, is precision personalization. And this is actually a big focus in like the wellness industry.
Okay.
And I think that there's this idea that we'll be able to, and you see it with people like Brian Johnson, there's this whole excitement of like, let's measure everything, put it in an algorithm, and like, let's get an output that gives us exactly like who we are and what's going on in our body. And I think on a conceptual level, that's really exciting, in the same way that on a conceptual level, the metaverse was exciting. It's like, yes, that sounds great. And I would love it if that could be. But there's a lot of space between now and then. And there's a lot of things that need to happen between now and then. And I think that like the science is sort of maybe getting ahead of itself, or even some companies are making promises that they can't fulfill. Like you've got these companies that are like, oh, we're just going to measure everything and then give you an output. But you only know what you measure. We can't measure everything. And so you have these giant blind spots. And then you have customers that will be like, oh, well, I've just measured everything. And it's like, well, what didn't you measure? And so this causes issues. Then you have the issues of like all of the interactions between biomarkers that we like really don't know about. We're still uncovering like all of the incredible interactions in our body. It's going to take a long time before we figure that out. And then you have like this idea of recommendations based on precision data. There are so few studies that we have around, okay, if I have this gene, should I eat that? Or is my blood type this, therefore I eat that. So a lot of excitement around precision personalization. We're not there yet.
Okay. That's cool though. I didn't know about any of sort of like epigenetic stuff. So that's like a whole new world.
Yeah.
Amazing. And what's next for Jung Longevity? Like where are you guys sort of, what's your vision? What's your kind of mission, and where do you see the brand going?
Yeah, I mean, we want to make longevity accessible. We want to make it accessible to the billions, not just the billionaires. And that's a confluence of price, ease, simplicity, but also impact. So I'm really proud. We just launched 4 months ago. It's been like riding a wild horse. I didn't expect it to be so full on. The good news is that like, customers really love what we have. People are actually buying and going into the program. It sort of boggles my mind, but like we have so many people that are going on subscription and building a kit. Like you don't know when you build something or how people are going to behave. For sure. So I think my priority has just been like making sure that we can deliver. Yeah. And scaling. So I think we've got some work to do to just make sure that we can deliver to all of the people who are coming to us for product. And now sort of what I'm looking at next is like, how can we scale, refine, reinforce?
Amazing. Before we get into just where people can find you, where people can get their hands on product, I always like to ask guests a couple of sort of lightning round questions. And I want to kick this off. So I think one thing that I love to ask is, what is like one product or habit that's significantly improved your life in the last, let's say, like 12 months to a year?
Am I allowed to use my own product?
Obviously.
Okay, this is not a plug.
Okay.
Genuinely, this is not a plug. I noticed at around 30, my healing would take a lot longer. And so I would go to the gym and I'd like knock myself on my foot and I'd get like a black and blue mark. And like starting around like 30, 31, 32 would just take forever to heal. Like it would just be like green on my leg forever. And since I've been taking our supplements, my healing, I could see it. I can feel it. My healing is like instant. Whereas like I've actually had like, I had a surgery a couple of weeks ago. And it wasn't like a major surgery, but I healed so fast. And when I showed the doctor, like, I had to send him pictures and and he was like, how are you so? And I was like, I had to laugh because he's a doctor and like, he knows that I have a supplement company. I was like,
wow.
Oh, I think it's my supplement. So he was like, he had this, doctors could be like kind of suspicious about supplements. But then when he saw, he was like, so that was pretty funny.
That's awesome. And what's outside of sort of the supplement protocol, what's one non-negotiable part of your kind of wellness or even say longevity routine?
You have to love doing it, I think. I'm a person where things come in waves for me. And like, there'll be moments where I really focus on my sleep protocol or really focus on my food protocol. But I think as I've gotten older, I've become better at not doing things because I feel like I should. But really developing a self-awareness of saying like, what do I really love doing? And what can I've become really good at that. And it's allowed me to go way deeper into things that I know are good for me, rather than just saying, I have to do this because I've been told I have to do this. It's like, what do I like doing that I know is good for me? That's where I double down my efforts. So I think that's been like the big like hack, is more self-awareness that has allowed me to make better and more sustainable health goals.
Okay. And I think more on the entrepreneurial side, if you could just give one piece of advice to anyone listening who either is an entrepreneur, is aspiring to be an entrepreneur one day, what would be your piece of advice for building a company?
Okay. I think that there's two things that entrepreneurs hear. One is you need to believe in yourself. And another thing is you need to be self-aware and you need to be sensitive. And both are true. And I think especially in the last 5 years, you've seen this real emphasis on like, you can't just, as a leader, you need to listen to your team and you really need to whatever. Both are true. But here's the truth. The truth is you need to believe in yourself. As an entrepreneur, I think it's really, you're always questioning yourself and there's so much doubt. And I think that you are ultimately alone as an entrepreneur. Everyone will always have an opinion. You're the only one that's responsible. And if you were to have to think, do I have to be more delusional or do I have to be more sensitive to my environment? I think you need both. But I would say allow yourself a little bit of delusion, because you need to stand in your own corner, because no one is going to stand in your corner for you.
I love that. This is what a beautiful way to end our conversation. So I guess just wrapping up, where can people find you? Where can people connect to you? Where can people find Jung, get products?
Yeah, sure. So we're foreveryoung.co. Jung is spelled Jung, like Carl Jung. My love for psychoanalysis. Carl Jung said, life begins at 40. Up until then, you're just doing research. So foreveryoung.co or Jung Longevity on Instagram. So at Jung Longevity, we have like a huge social community. We love Instagram. So check us out on either.
Amazing. And we will put links in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining us, Simon.
Thank you for having me. It's been so much fun.